Hello. In this lecture for BME, I would like to tell you about different neuroimaging techniques that we can use to measure the brain. Let me just remind you, the principles of a brain-computer interface are that we try to measure signals from the brain. We try to extract relevant features from the brain that are related to certain psychological states or tasks that you do within your own head. For example, if you imagine left hand movement or right hand foot imagery, then this results in a different brain signal, and that we can use to operate certain devices. So you can give output commands to brain-computer interface applications. And this man, for example, is moving a robotic arm with the power of his brain, popularly said. So the ultimate goal for me is that you can think of your own brain-computer interface application. In the end, I want you to use your imagination to invent your own BCI. And you can use inspiration, for example, from Black Mirror. Do you know the episode Playtest? You have this guy, a backpacker from Australia, who needs some money. He signs up for a research in a game company where they implant him with a brain-computer interface, so an implant in his brain, and then he is immersed in a game that he can see through his own brain. So rather than using augmented reality or virtual reality, the game is really taking place inside of his brain. And what he can do then, he sees, for example, this virtual hamster, and he can try to touch it, he can try to hammer it, and this is the start of the game. Eventually, you'll see that the brain-computer interface is able to also read his deepest fears within his brain, and then he finds himself in a game where he encounters past memories, for example, of his former school friend who is takes the place, who is inside of this spider somehow, and then it becomes a bit creepy. So please see this episode and have some inspiration from this. Today I want to start to teach you about the sub-goals that we need to learn before you can think of such a brain-computer interface applications. And for the measurement part, I want you to be able to list and explain neuroimaging techniques that can be used for brain-computer interfaces. And I also want you to be able to evaluate the techniques based on the location of the instruments, the temporal versus spatial resolution, the risk, efficiency, and the cost. Let's do this. Okay, so there are different techniques to measure brain signals. And the first distinction that you could make is that we have, let me try to grab a pen. You distinguish non-invasive techniques and invasive techniques. Non-invasive techniques are instruments, sensors that are placed outside of the skull, and invasive techniques are placed inside of the skull. A very common used neuroimaging technique is the EEG, or the electroencephalogram, where we place this electrode cap on your head with here sensors in the cap, and then we can measure the electrical activity from your brain. Lately, there are also devices being made, commercial EEG headsets that you can place on the brain quite easily. So this is the medical version or the clinical version, and this is the commercial version that is a bit cheaper but also less precise. We could also use functional magnetic resonance imaging, or fMRI, where we place you in this tunnel, and the tunnel is measuring the activity and the oxygen level within your blood through magnetic resonance imaging. And another technique is FNIRS, which stands for Functional Near-Infrared Spectroscopy. It's a very difficult word, which also looks at the blood oxygenation level, but in a much cheaper way. So FNIRS is cheaper than fMRI because you need a very big and bulky equipment for this, which you place in a hospital. And this you can take to somebody's home, which has a lot of advantages. Then there are also some invasive techniques. For example, the electrocorticography, which also measures electrical activity just like the EEG, except now the electrodes are placed directly onto the brain, and it looks like this. So sorry for the bloody picture. You have to make a hole in somebody's skull and place the electrodes directly onto the brain. So here you see the patch with the electrodes on it. And here are the wires that go outside of the skull, and this is how we can measure electrical signals. I'm sure you have a lot of questions about this technique. Ask them during the question and answer session, please. Another way of doing it is by using microelectrode arrays. And these are little pins, very tiny pins, that you place into the tissue of the brain. So it's even a bit more invasive than the electrocorticogram, because you insert them within the cortex of the brain. So these are different measures, different ways to measure the brain activity. Now I want to talk to you about the electroencephalogram, or EEG, that was invented by Hans Berger in 1929, because the EEG is the cheapest way to record brain signals. It's also the most often used, and I think if you know the principles of this one, it will help you to think of new brain-computer interface applications. And you need to understand a little bit how neuroscience works before you can think of applications. So the EEG measures the potentials on the brain, electrical activity on the brain. And for this you always need 2 points. So for example, this is an old-fashioned EEG recorder that measures, in this case, this signal is being recorded by the difference between this position, this is an electrode on the head, and this position. So the difference in potential between these two electrodes gives way to the electrical signal. And similarly, this EEG trace is being recorded by measuring the difference between this electrode and the T3 electrode. Now, here you see some important things. We measure the EEG in microvolts, and often 50 microvolts is about the size of the human EEG. And we also, it's very important that we know in what time we're speaking. And EEG has a very high temporal resolution, so it's very precise in time. And we know within 1 millisecond what kind of scribbles were made and how the EEG looks like. Now, EEG can be measured in different ways. Here in the top left, this is a very old-fashioned way of putting electrodes, pasting them onto the skull of a person. You use some electrode paste for that, and you place them directly onto the skull. To make it a bit more convenient, companies have thought of this electrode cap, where all the electrodes are inserted within the cap, and you just place it on top of the brain. You have to position it so the electrodes are on the right spot, and then you can do the measurement. Here you see the same, and here you see a child with an electrode cap. Here you see a different kind of net that is a bit more transparent, but you can place up to 256 electrodes onto the skull. Here you see an example from the company Emotive that made a very commercial headset with which you can measure EEG. I've tested it in the past. It works, let's say a bit, I think maybe 2/3 of the power of a real recording system, but it works and it's a lot cheaper. And here you see some in-ear EEG, which is a very novel form of non-obtrusive measurement of the EEG, but it's very localized, so you can only measure then in the ear. Okay, there are also some commercial applications being made, because now we can use the brain signals and the EEG. For example, a project called NecoMimi invented a way of recording brain activity, or at least that's what they say so. And then the ears of this lady respond to her current mood. So if she's happy, the ears are upright, and if you feel sad, the ears automatically turn to the bottom. Also as some inspiration. So where do we measure the EEG? So here I have a picture of the skull. This is the skull, and this is the brain. In the brain, you've learned in the lectures from Eric, there are neurons, and the neurons sometimes fire and sometimes don't fire. If sufficient of these neurons fire synchronously, so if they fire together, then the summation of their synapses, of their potentials, reaches the surface of the brain. And here we can grab it with an EEG electrode. So actually you need two. This picture is wrong. You always need two. And these signals are being transported to an amplifier, with which we can record the signals. So many neurons need to sum their activity in order to be detected by EEG electrodes. Their activity is crucial. Synchronized neural activity produces larger signals. And then the sum of all of these little signals that are given, so there are different summations, different sources are contributing, of course, together, and the sum of that is what we record here at the top, at the EEG. So how does an EEG recording look like? Well, this is an EEG recording of several positions on the head, several sensors of the head. And I'd like you to be able to orient yourself a little bit in such an EEG recording. So what we have, first look over here. You see here on top of somebody's head, and here you see from the side of somebody's head. So on top of somebody's head, you see different positions and different letters. And once you know the trick, it's actually quite difficult. So first I'm going to draw a line here. So everything on the left hemisphere, which is here, it's the left hemisphere, this is the right hemisphere. And what you notice probably is that the numbers of the electrode, here you see FP1, F3, F7. On the opposite is the even number. So odd numbers are on the left, even numbers are on the right. Is this important for your application? No, you can forget about this, just extra information. And then the letters tell you something about the region over which the electrodes are placed. So FP stands for prefrontal cortex, frontal cortex, temporal cortex, central cortex, posterior cortex, and occipital cortex. And they correspond to certain brain regions. For example, occipital cortex is the place where the visual information processing is being taken place. So now we can record different brain signals. And here you see a recording of 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12, 13, 14, 15, 16 EEG signals being measured. Ooh, it's difficult to write like this. Yes. And you also see an EOG channel and an ECG channel. EOG stands for electrooculogram, with which we can measure the activity from the eyes, the brain activity from the eyes. And you see, for example, here a blink, somebody blinked with their eyes. Here somebody made a movement with their eyes. And we also have a channel called the ECG. This is the electrocardiogram. So this is activity from the heart. And you see here every now and then this night heartbeat. And we need this information also from the eyes and from the heart, because sometimes we have an interference of those other biosignals onto the brain signals. And we need to filter them out. So what does the EEG tell us? So the frequencies of the EEG can give us information about the state of the brain. For example, is the brain normal and awake? So are you active doing, for example, a mental calculation task? Or are you relaxed, sitting in a chair with your eyes closed? Are you drowsy, almost falling asleep? Or are you already asleep? Or are you in deep sleep? And sometimes, maybe if a person is in a coma, this is what the EEG would look like. I think what you will notice going from very excited to going to coma is a slowing of the frequency. So higher frequencies are in the EEG once you are cognitively have a high cognitive load, whereas if you go into a coma or go into a sleep, you see that lower frequencies are more present in the EEG. So you could attach certain states and certain frequencies. Certain frequencies are related to certain states of the brain, and we give them names like gamma, which is connected to 20 to 60 hertz, related to cognitive frequency band. We distinguish beta rhythms, which are 14 to 20 hertz, that belong to an activated cortex. For example, if you engage in mental calculation. Alpha, which is a pattern that is always in your brain, but it is more pronounced when you're quiet, waking. You can induce it very well if you close your eyes, then you see a lot of alpha. Theta activity is related to 4 to 7 hertz. It belongs to the sleep stages. And delta, less than 4 hertz, belongs to when you are in deep sleep. Okay, so now I ask you the following question. What is true? EEG has a high spatial resolution or EEG has a low spatial resolution? And does it have a high temporal resolution or a low temporal resolution? Think about this question for a bit. So I don't know if you thought about it. The correct answer would be that EEG has a low spatial resolution. We're very poor in telling where the information comes from in the brain because it is a summation of different signals coming from the brain. So it has a low spatial resolution, but it has a high temporal resolution. It's very precise in time. We know very well to the millisecond when the signal was being given. So again, here we have a sample of an EEG recording. This is for one channel over a period of 4 seconds. And you see this little scribbling, right? So I want you to understand the power spectrum, because for us it's always important to look at the frequencies within the EEG. So if we plot the power, or let's say popularly said, the presence of different frequencies within the EEG, power, sorry for my bad handwriting, and here on the x-axis we place the frequency in hertz. Then what you see is that the lower frequencies always have a higher amplitude. Maybe you see that here. The lower frequencies have a higher amplitude in general, and the higher frequencies have a lower amplitude. So this is general, the ideal picture of the power spectrum. If we look at it in reality, you see a little bit this line that I described here, but you also see a peak here around, let's say, 8 hertz. And this is the alpha rhythm. And the alpha rhythm is always more pronounced because it's just more dominant in your brain. So usually what you see in a normal healthy adult is you always see this kind of a bump, with this bump being around 8 to 12 hertz And that's the alpha rhythm. It's perfectly normal. Okay, apart from looking at frequencies and amplitudes in the normal ongoing EEG, we can also look at event-related potentials. These are potentials that occur after we've presented an event or a stimulus to a participant. So let's say you have a participant here. There is one electrode that we measure. We put the signals into the amplifier, so we amplify the signal, we can see it. And then at a certain point, I present a tone. A music, for example. And this is the moment where the stimulus onset begins. This is where I present the tone. And then I look at the EEG signal over time. Okay, but in one time presenting this tone, I don't get a lot of information about how the brain responds to this tone. For this, I need maybe to present the tone 100 times, and then I average the signal. And when I average the signal of 100 trials, that's what you call one of these segments, if you average those segments, then you see the event-related potential. And you can see that within 700 milliseconds after presenting the tone, you see a very typical deflection. First, a negative potential, then a positive potential, and then again a negative potential. And then it slowly goes back to zero again. Now these are event-related potential, and these spikes, these peaks, tell us a little bit about the information processing within the brain. For example, if you look at this one, you think maybe this is a random picture, but this is actually almost around 200 milliseconds after stimulus onset, and we call this the N200. N200. A negative potential after 200 milliseconds after the stimulus onset. And what the N200 tells us, psychologists, psychophysiologists, is that an event was detected, a tone was detected. If I present the sound louder than I did, I will see that there is a rise in the N200. Similarly, if somebody is paying attention to these sounds, I will see that there is a larger positive peak. This one is the P300. So all of these potentials and tricks we can use to understand better the brain. And we also use these event-related potentials within brain-computer interfaces. Okay, of course in the EEG we also have a lot of hindrance from artifacts. How do artifacts look like? Here you see again a recording of the EEG over these signals, and here again you see the electrocardiogram being measured, but the rest of them, these are brain signals. Oh, apart from this one, this is EOG, electroocardiogram. What do you think the artifacts might be if you look at this picture? I think maybe you understand that these are the artifacts. These little spikes, those are not so normal. And this is in fact an electrode artifact. There's probably a short disconnection between the skull and the electrode. So this is why you see this very steep shift in the potentials. Here you also see some artifacts. I don't know if you can notice them already, but for this you need to know here is the EOG channel. So here you see what's happening with the eye movement at certain time periods. And I think you see that on these electrodes, which are supposed to measure brain activity, you also see these shifts, right? And if you look closely, you see that they're connected to the moments where somebody was moving their eyes. So these are eye movement artifacts. And they don't tell you anything about the brain, they tell you about something about what happened to the brain eye movement. You need to filter them out. Also in this pattern, you see here again the brain signals, you see here the ECG, and you can see artifacts herein as well. And I'll tell you where. On this channel, I see artifacts. This is an artifact, and this is an artifact, this one. And what do you think they're related to? For this, you need to look at the whole spectrum again, and you see, hey, they seem to be related to the ECG, the electrocardiogram. So in fact, this sensor on the skull seems to be picking up activity from the electrocardio from the heart. So it's an heart artifact, and you need to filter it out. Okay, a quick scanning. So if you would go into the business of brain-computer interfacing, you become more familiar with EEG. You can also do some diagnosis or make some impression. Am I looking at a normal EEG? And what is a normal EEG? For example, this would be a trace of normal EEG, and then in comparison abnormal EEG, like this. Here I see a significant slowing of the EEG, which might indicate that a person is asleep, but if he's not asleep, I would certainly be a bit worried if I see something like this. Well, don't you worry about that. This is something you will learn if you go into brain-computer interfacing. Okay, so let's go back to our other learning objective, is that you have to understand, you have to be able to evaluate a little bit the neuroimaging techniques. So I've told you about different neuroimaging techniques. Let's first discuss this temporal and spatial resolution again. You see here in the red all the invasive neuroimaging techniques, the ECOG, local field potentials, microelectroarrays, and micro electrodes that you can place into the skull. So these are being placed under the skull. And what you probably notice is that they have a very high temporal resolution. So they're very precise in time. Then some of them have a very high spatial resolution as well. For example, the micro electrodes, because you insert them directly onto the neurons, you can measure neurons directly. And this is why we know very precisely where the signal is being measured. And the ECOG, where you place the electrodes on top of the brain, but under the skull, they still collect the summation of electrical signals. So they have a poorer spatial resolution than the microelectrode arrays, for example. But it's still better than the EEG. So the EEG still has a high temporal resolution, but it has a poor spatial resolution. And functional magnetic resonance imaging, for example, the one we see here, and FNIRS have a poor spatial resolution, but also quite a poor temporal resolution, because they are measured in terms of seconds. So here you see that it needs 1 to 10 seconds to measure the fMRI. So imagine I present a tone, beep. I look at the brain and I have to wait 10 seconds before I can record your response to it. So the fMRI has a low temporal resolution. So let's look at these neuroimaging techniques in terms of risk, efficiency, and cost. The cheapest way to obtain brain signals is by measuring the EEG. It's also quite efficient because I can place an electrode cap on your head, I think, in about 5 minutes. Okay, I have some practice, but let's say most people can do this within half an hour. You can place the electrodes on the brain and start measuring. Whereas if I need to give you a brain implant or implant electrodes onto your skull or into your skull, I need an operation. So it's a lot less efficient than EEG. In terms of cost, there is a difference as well. The fMRI is very costly. You need a very big machine for this, and you need to go to the hospital, and the recording time, you need to pay a lot of money for this. So this is not really practical for everyday applications. Also here, I'd say that EEG or fNIRS is at least still payable. But if you want to think of an application with an implanted electrode, that's fine. Then you think of something that is happening maybe in the future where consumers get a brain implant and then use it for something.